A man in the Philippines spit into a tube, sent it to a lab, and got results back that said he carried Levantine ancestry from the region that today includes Israel, Lebanon, and Jordan. His family had been Catholic for as long as anyone could remember. Nobody in his entire family had ever mentioned anything Jewish, not once. A woman in southern India found Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry markers in her DNA results that her family had absolutely no explanation for. A community in Zimbabwe, Black African people who speak Bantu languages and have lived in southern Africa for generations, turned out to carry a specific genetic marker that belongs almost exclusively to the ancient Jewish priestly lineage, the Cohen modal haplotype. In the Buba clan of the Lemba people, researchers found that marker at frequencies comparable to Jewish populations living thousands of miles away in the Middle East. And in China, in the city of Kaifeng, in Henan province, there are families right now who carry Y-DNA haplogroups linking them genetically to Bukharian Jews from Uzbekistan, a connection that just 2 years ago, in 2024, was confirmed by genetic research published in the Sino-Judaic Institute's own newsletter. If any of this sounds impossible to you, you are about to understand why it is not only possible, it is documented, verified, and happening all over the world right now. Stay with me for every single one of these 7 signs, because by the end of this video, you may look at your own family completely differently. And subscribe right now and hit that bell, because this channel goes deep into the science of ancestry every single week, and you will not want to miss what is coming. Before we get into the 7 signs, you need to understand one thing. The Jewish people are, by any scientific measure, one of the most studied populations in the history of human genetics. The reason for this is not complicated. The Jewish diaspora, the global scattering of Jewish communities across thousands of years, was driven by a series of historical events that geneticists call natural experiments. The destruction of the first temple, the Babylonian exile in 597 BCE, the destruction of the Second Temple by Rome in 70 CE, the Spanish Inquisition and the mass expulsion of 1492, the Ottoman persecutions, the pogroms across Eastern Europe across multiple centuries. Each of these catastrophes pushed Jewish communities into new territories, forced some to convert outwardly while practicing privately, and created a scattered trail of ancestry that modern DNA science is now reading with extraordinary precision. Advances in genetic testing have led researchers to estimate that as many as 152 million people worldwide, roughly 1.85% of the entire global population, may carry traces of Jewish ancestry in their DNA, often without knowing it. In the United States alone, estimates suggest around 15.8 million people may have Jewish roots they are completely unaware of. These are not wild guesses. These are figures that emerge from analyzing millions of consumer DNA results alongside population genetics research. And what that research keeps finding over and over again is that the genetic signature of ancient Jewish ancestry is extraordinarily durable. It survives religious conversion, it survives centuries of geographic isolation, it survives even when every other marker of identity has been deliberately removed. Now, let us go through the 7 signs. The first sign is a DNA test result that does not match your family story. This is the starting point for thousands of people every year. You sit down, open the app, and expect results that line up with whatever your grandparents always told you about where the family came from. And then you see something that stops you cold. Results showing Ashkenazi Jewish, Sephardic Jewish, or Middle Eastern ancestry, specifically from the Levant region, the area that corresponds to modern-day Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria. These results are appearing in people from backgrounds as varied as Filipino, Indonesian, South Indian, Chinese, Ethiopian, and dozens of other ancestries. And the first reaction is almost never excitement. It is confusion, because there is no family story that accounts for it. Here is what is scientifically happening. The haplogroups, the deep genetic lineages tracked by population geneticists that are most strongly associated with ancient Jewish populations, include primarily haplogroups J1 and J2 on the paternal side. These trace directly to the ancient Near East, specifically to the Levant. They traveled with Jewish populations as those communities moved, and Jewish communities moved everywhere. From as early as the 7th and 8th centuries CE, Jewish merchants traveled the Silk Road, the trade routes connecting the Mediterranean to Central Asia, India, and China. In many cases, they did not just pass through, they settled. They married locally. Their children were raised in whatever religion was practiced by the local community. And within 1 or 2 generations, the Jewish identity went underground. But the DNA stayed. There's also the matter of the Radhanites, a network of Jewish merchants who operated between roughly the 8th and 11th centuries, connecting the Frankish kingdoms of Western Europe all the way to Tang Dynasty China. They moved through North Africa, across the Arabian Peninsula, through Persia, into India, and into Central Asia. They were among the only traders of their era who could operate freely across both Christian and Islamic lands because they belonged to neither power and both sides needed what they carried. They left behind goods. They also left behind descendants. In 2024, the Avotainu DNA Project, which has compiled over 10,000 DNA results from Jewish communities worldwide, published preliminary genetic findings on the Kaifeng Jewish community of China, confirming that at least one lineage of Kaifeng Jews shares Y-DNA haplogroup RFT14557 with a Bukharian Jew from Uzbekistan, with their common male ancestor estimated to have lived around the year 1000 CE. This is not mythology. This is a molecular trail across the ancient Silk Road, confirmed by genetic testing in 2024. If your DNA test came back with results your family cannot explain, that result is more likely to be a real historical echo than a lab error. The second sign is family customs that have no explanation in your current religion. This is the sign that lives not in a database, but in your kitchen, in the way your grandmother prepared meat, in rules your family follows that nobody can fully account for. Historians and anthropologists have a specific term for this, crypto-Jewish practice. It refers to the continuation of Jewish customs by people who no longer identify as Jewish, sometimes people who have not identified as Jewish for 500 or 600 years. This happened because forced conversions, whether under the Spanish Inquisition, under Ottoman pressure, or in other historical moments of persecution, were often external. Prayers changed, church attendance began. But in the small rituals of daily life, behind closed doors, something older kept going. What does this look like in practice? It looks like a family that does not eat pork, with no clear religious reason attached to that rule. The family might be nominally Christian or Muslim or Hindu, but there is an unspoken, passed-down household rule against pork that none of the elders can explain beyond saying, that is just how we have always done it. Pork avoidance is the most documented example of crypto-Jewish practice found in communities across South and Southeast Asia, Latin America, and West Africa. It looks like a family that treats one specific day of the week as a rest day with unusual seriousness, not necessarily aligned perfectly with a formal religious Sabbath, but observed as something close to sacred, as a day for family and stillness with a weight that the family itself cannot fully explain. It looks like a family that covers mirrors after a death. The Jewish mourning practice, called Shiva, includes covering mirrors in the home of the deceased. This specific custom, not common in most world religions, has been documented in families across Latin America, the Philippines, India, and West Africa, whose Jewish connections were only discovered when genetics entered the picture. It looks like women in the household lighting candles on Friday evening with a regularity that feels like ritual, even though nobody calls it that. In communities in New Mexico, in the United States, in the interior of Portugal, in parts of Brazil, and in scattered communities across Asia, this specific practice has been found to have survived 5 centuries after the original Jewish community was forced to convert. It looks like a particular way of preparing meat, draining the blood before cooking, salting the meat carefully, keeping certain foods separate, practices that are direct echoes of kashrut, the Jewish dietary system, found in families with no conscious memory of where these rules came from. And it looks like a family culture of not asking questions about the past. In families where a secret was buried deep enough that it could not be named anymore, the silence itself became a habit. Children were raised to accept customs without demanding explanations. That silence, passed down generation after generation, is one of the most consistent features found in communities with hidden Jewish ancestry. The key indicator is not any single practice in isolation. It is the combination of several of these things with no coherent origin in the family's current religious framework. When something has been done for generations, and nobody knows why, it is almost always because the explanation was deliberately removed at some point. The third sign is a surname that carries a hidden map. Names are the oldest form of recorded identity. They carry information across centuries, even when every other part of the historical record has been erased. Sephardic Jews, the communities expelled from Spain and Portugal beginning in 1492, followed very specific naming patterns that can still be traced today across the world. The first pattern is geographic surnames. When Jewish families were forced out of the Iberian Peninsula, many took the name of the town or city they came from. Names like Toledo, Navarro, Castillo, Leon, and Cardoso are among the most common. These surnames appear today in communities across Latin America, in parts of Southeast Asia that were colonized by Spain and Portugal, and along the old Sephardic trade routes through the Mediterranean and beyond. The second pattern is occupational surnames. Names connected to trade, goldsmithing, medicine, and scholarship were common in Jewish communities across the ancient and medieval world, and in places where Jewish merchants settled along trade routes, their descendants sometimes carry surnames that trace back to these same occupational roots. The third pattern is what linguists call Hebraicized surnames, names either derived directly from Hebrew words or phonetic translations of Hebrew names into local languages. The name Cohen, or its many variations across different languages, refers specifically to the ancient Jewish priestly class, the Kohanim. It carries with it the Cohen modal haplotype, a specific Y-chromosome marker that has been found in communities across the world wherever this priestly surname appears in any of its forms. In the Philippines, historians have noted that surnames like de la Cruz, Santos, and Reyes were often assigned during forced baptisms in the Spanish colonial period, frequently to families that had been practicing Jews before colonization forced conversion. In China, the ancient Kaifeng Jewish community used surnames that were phonetic approximations of Hebrew names converted into Mandarin, names like Ai, Shi, Gao, Jin, Zhang, Li, and Zhao, which were the 7 clan surnames recorded in Kaifeng's Jewish community. If your family carries a surname that does not seem to fit your known cultural background, one that comes from a language or place that your family has no other connection to, it is worth investigating where that name actually comes from. The answer may be older and more specific than anyone in your family has guessed. The 4th sign is a family medical history that includes rare diseases concentrated in Jewish populations. This is the most scientifically precise sign on this entire list, and it is the one that most people have never heard of. There's a specific group of genetic diseases found at significantly elevated rates in people with Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry compared to the general global population. These are not diseases caused by being Jewish. They became concentrated in Jewish populations through a process called the founder effect, the genetic consequence of a community that for extended periods of history married almost exclusively within itself. When a population remains closed and endogamous for long enough, rare genetic mutations that happen to exist in the founding group become more common with every generation. The diseases associated with this founder effect in Ashkenazi Jewish populations include Tay-Sachs disease, Gaucher disease, familial dysautonomia, Canavan disease, Bloom syndrome, Fanconi anemia, and BRCA1 and BRCA2 gene mutations linked to significantly elevated cancer risk. These are rare conditions in the general population, but in Ashkenazi Jewish populations, the carrier rates are dramatically higher. Approximately 1 in 10 Ashkenazi Jews carries a genetic mutation causing Gaucher disease, compared to roughly 1 in 100 in non-Jewish populations. Approximately 1 in 40 people of Ashkenazi Jewish origin carries a BRCA gene mutation, compared to about 1 in 250 in the general population. Tay-Sachs carrier rates in Ashkenazi Jewish populations are between 10 and 27 times higher than in the broader population, depending on the specific mutation. These are not marginal differences. They are stark population-specific signals. And here is the part most people do not know. These same disease markers have been found at higher than expected rates in populations with no known Jewish identity, in communities across the world that converted or assimilated centuries ago. When a genetic researcher encounters elevated Gaucher disease carrier rates in a community in India, or finds Tay-Sachs carriers in a population in the Middle East whose ancestors converted to Islam generations back, this is treated as significant evidence of a shared ancestral connection to the original founding population. It is not cultural. It is not interpretation. It is a specific genetic variant appearing at a specific frequency that can only be explained by a shared origin. If you or anyone in your family has been diagnosed with one of these conditions, or if you are a carrier, speak to your doctor or a genetic counselor about the population history of that specific variant. The answer may point toward an ancestry that no family document has ever mentioned. The 5th sign is an oral tradition about a different or distant origin. Every family has a story, and in families that carry a hidden ancestry, there is almost always a fragment of that story still being passed down, usually vague, usually incomplete, but persistent. In some families, it takes the form of an ancestor who came from far away, a great-great-grandfather who arrived from across the water, from a land to the west, from a city that nobody in the current generation can find on a map. The story is preserved not because it is celebrated, but because it is simply old enough that no one got around to erasing it. In other families, the story involves danger. Ancestors who had to leave somewhere quickly, who changed their name, changed their religion, changed everything about how they presented themselves to the outside world. These stories are especially common in Sephardic diaspora communities because the 1492 expulsion from Spain was exactly that kind of rupture, a moment when entire communities were forced to either convert, leave, or die in a matter of months. In Mexico and across Latin America, researchers have collected oral histories from families who describe ancestors who observed customs in secret, who kept books hidden, who said prayers that nobody else in the village recognized. When these accounts have been cross-referenced with genetic data, Jewish ancestry has been confirmed in dozens of documented cases. In Asian communities, the oral tradition takes a slightly different form, not flight, but commerce. An ancestor described as a great merchant who arrived from a distant land, who settled, integrated, and married locally, but who always maintained something slightly different about the way the household was run. These merchant ancestors described in families from Iran to India to the Philippines to China are in many documented cases traceable to the ancient Jewish trading networks that connected the Middle East to Asia across more than 1,000 years. The detail historians look for most specifically in these oral traditions is direction. Ancestors described as coming from the west, from the direction of the setting sun, from a land across the water. In the context of Asian communities, this directional detail often points toward the Middle East. Not always, but often enough that when it appears alongside genetic and cultural evidence, it has been used to establish credible ancestral connections. There is also the recurring memory of a book the ancestors kept that was not the scripture the family currently uses, a book that was eventually hidden, buried, burned, or simply lost. In the documented history of crypto-Jewish communities across Latin America and Asia, that book was almost always some form of Hebrew religious text. The memory of it outlasted the book itself by hundreds of years. If your family carries a story about a different origin, no matter how vague, write it down. Ask the oldest people in your family to tell it in full. What sounds like a folktale may be the most historically accurate document your family possesses. The sixth sign is physical features that consistently do not match the regional pattern. This is the sign people notice first and understand last. When physical appearance does not match what is expected for a given population or region, the default explanation is always something simple. A grandparent from a different province, a feature that just runs in the family. But genetics tells a more specific story. The physical characteristics most commonly associated with ancient Levantine ancestry, the region from which the Jewish people emerged, include a longer midface structure, a prominent nasal bridge, deep-set eyes, a strong jaw, hair that is naturally curlier than the regional norm, and a skin tone that is slightly different from surrounding populations, sometimes more olive-toned in ways that do not match neighbors. None of these features alone means anything definitive, but a consistent combination appearing across multiple generations of a family from a region where none of these features are typical is a genetic signal. It indicates what geneticists call an admixture event, a mixing of populations at some point in history that introduced a set of physical traits into the family line and that have been carried forward ever since. In certain Brahmin communities in Kerala and Tamil Nadu in southern India, researchers have documented a higher than expected frequency of Middle Eastern genetic markers, alongside physical features that are atypical for the broader South Indian population. In Fujian province on the coast of China, where the historical Kaifeng Jewish community sent traders south during the Song dynasty, communities with features described as distinct by their own neighbors have been studied for exactly this kind of genetic admixture. In communities across the Philippines, particularly in areas heavily impacted by the Spanish colonial period, during which Sephardic Jewish merchants were among the earliest non-indigenous settlers, there are families with physical features that the surrounding communities describe as different without knowing why. The most thoroughly documented case of this kind is in Ethiopia, where the Beta Israel community, Ethiopian Jews, have been genetically confirmed to carry both sub-Saharan African ancestry and a significant ancient Middle Eastern genetic component, tracing directly to the Levant. Their physical features reflect that precise mixture. This is not a disputed or marginal finding. It is one of the most completely documented cases of ancient Jewish ancestry persisting in a non-Middle Eastern population. Physical appearance is not proof, but it is a prompt, especially when it keeps appearing across generations in a family that has no other explanation for it. The seventh sign is a tight pattern of endogamy, marrying only within a very specific, narrow community for generations. This is the behavioral sign, and it is one of the most consistent patterns found across every Jewish diaspora community in the world, regardless of where they eventually settled or what religion they adopted on the surface. It is the pattern of marrying not just within the same broad ethnicity or religion, which is common almost everywhere, but within a narrowly defined social group, often just a few hundred families, generation after generation. The directive to marry within the community is one of the oldest and most constant features of Jewish social organization across history, and it did not disappear when Jewish communities converted or assimilated into surrounding populations. It continued in a form stripped of its original meaning, but retaining its social function. The community simply kept marrying within itself for reasons that later generations could no longer fully explain. The genetic consequence of extended endogamy is that the population becomes highly similar to itself internally and genetically distinct from surrounding populations. This is part of the reason why Ashkenazi Jews today, despite having lived in Europe for over 1,000 years, are genetically more similar to Middle Eastern populations than to the European populations they lived among. The endogamy preserved the original genetic signature across centuries of geographic separation. This same pattern when found in non-Jewish communities, is one of the most reliable indicators that researchers look for when investigating hidden Jewish ancestry. The Lemba people of Zimbabwe and South Africa, the case that opened this video, historically exhibited exactly this pattern of tight endogamy combined with distinctive customs, food rules, and physical features that differed from surrounding Bantu populations. When researchers led by Tudor Parfitt of the University of London tested Lemba men, they found that the Cohen modal haplotype, the genetic marker belonging to the ancient Jewish priestly class, was present in the Buba priestly clan of the Lemba at frequencies comparable to Jewish populations in the Middle East, a people who had preserved an identity in their blood that they had forgotten how to name. If your family comes from a community that has a documented tradition of marrying only within a specific and relatively small social group, and if that community shares physical features, customs, or surnames that seem distinct from the broader population around them, this is a significant flag worth investigating. What that tells you is something profound about the nature of identity and the nature of time. There is a God who placed this world and all its peoples into motion, and the trail that ancient Jewish communities left across the world, through trade, through persecution, through forced conversion, through centuries of quiet survival, was not random. It is a trail written in blood, in DNA, in customs, in names, and oral traditions, half remembered by people who can no longer explain where they come from. And now, for the first time in human history, science has given us a way to read that trail. If you recognized yourself or your family in any of the signs we went through today, the starting point is simple. A consumer DNA test is the fastest first step. If you already have results, uploading your raw DNA data to a platform that allows deeper haplogroup analysis will give you more detail. Ask your oldest relatives to tell you every story they know about where the family came from. Write those stories down. Ask about the customs that nobody can explain. Ask about the rules that have always been there. Because the past is not gone. It is waiting in your blood, in your name, in your kitchen, in the oldest stories your family tells. Share this video if it made you think. Leave a comment below telling me which of the 7 signs hit closest to home, and subscribe so you do not miss the next one.